By now you've heard about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, about her passing. The news and social media have been full of stories and memories about her life as a Supreme Court Justice and about her life before that, and really the struggles that she went through throughout her life up to that point and even beyond that, and just the cancer and all of the other struggles that she faced in life. One thing in particular she is remembered for is all the work she has done with equal rights for women. But there's still a lot more to be done, obviously, and I think she certainly would say that if she were with us here today. And this was something I thought about as I saw a recent report showing the difference in pay between men and women at the White House. Not just at the White House. Obviously, there is a big difference in pay throughout our nation. But this was just, for whatever reason, looking at White House pay. With women earning only 69 cents for every dollar that men make. Equal pay is important, isn't it? That's a topic in the parable from Jesus that we've heard this morning. It's one that comes right on the heels of one that we heard last Sunday when Jesus responds to Peter's question about forgiveness, about how many times we have to actually forgive someone. It was about the unmerciful servant who was unwilling to forgive. And in this parable that we've heard this morning, Jesus continues that theme about forgiveness. It's almost like Jesus knows that we need to hear about forgiveness. And we still need to hear about it today, don't we? As followers of His, we still struggle with this. We are no better than Peter when it comes to this question. So, Jesus tells them a story about the kingdom of heaven. He says, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. In other words, you disciples still can't get it. So I'm going to keep telling you stories so that you'll get it, that you'll really understand what this way of God in our world is really like. So he tells them this story about a vineyard, about a day in the life of its owner and workers. The owner goes out in the morning looking for workers for the day, finds some, and then hires them with a promise of a day's wage at the end of the day. This would be expected, right? If you'll come work in my vineyard, I will pay you for the full day, and we will do this after the workday is over. So they get to work. They start working out in the vineyard. At other times during the day, the landowner sees other people standing around, idle, looking for work, and so he hires them as well. Some were even hired at the end of the day, like when there's 1 hour left in the workday, and he hires them. He pays them all the same wage, which leads the first workers to complain to the owner, since they had been there all day, out in the scorching heat, as they say, while the others didn't start working until later. The owner responds to them by telling them that he paid them per their agreement. He did just exactly what he promised to do. He paid them a full day's wage. And that they should take whatever they had been given. He says, take it and go. Take what belongs to you. And he reminds them that he is actually the owner, and that if he wants to pay other workers the same amount, then that's up to him. He then chides them for being envious of his generosity. And so Jesus then wraps up the whole parable with a conclusion that says, so the last will be first, and the first will be last. I'm sure the disciples were still looking at each other going, what? What are we supposed to do with this, Jesus? With this statement, Jesus reinforced what he had just said about God's generosity with mercy when it comes to forgiveness. how God forgives them of their debts and how they are to do the same for each other. That's how the kingdom of heaven works, on a whole different system than how the world operates. They're still thinking in worldly terms. They're still thinking in the way they've always done it. And Jesus says there's a different way that I am bringing into the world. This is the kingdom of heaven. Just like God generously gave everyone the same amount of manna to Israelites wandering in the wilderness, so God generously gives equal amounts of grace to everyone. With that being God's order of things, the disciples, they weren't to grumble about who deserves it and who doesn't. God's equalizing grace was for all of them. And who were they to grumble about it or to compete with one another in order to get it? I mean, we would think, well, surely the disciples of Jesus would never compete with one another. Well, they did. And we see that throughout the Gospels. I remember when our kids were little and would sometimes get envious of what the other had. One day I was serving up a regular favorite for breakfast in our house, waffles with peanut butter. After spreading peanut butter on top of the waffles, I served one to Maggie Lee and one to Jack. Seconds later, great wailing began as Maggie Lee noticed that not all of her squares on her waffle had peanut butter in them, while Jack's did. I was accused of cutting her short a few squares. I laughed, which didn't help the situation, and later thought of how we are all that way at times. Aren't we? We're all like toddlers, envious of what others have. Surely we aren't the kind of people who struggle with forgiveness, mercy, and each other, are we? I'm thinking we are. Like Peter, we struggle with having to forgive someone who we don't think deserves it. We question God's ways in our world and how backwards they seem to be at times. Do you think that? Do you ever think God is backwards? Doesn't seem to be paying attention? When we see what's going on, and maybe God just overlooks it, we accuse God of not really getting it, not really understanding. We grumble and complain when we see other people who haven't been living for God like we have. They get the same grace that we got. How dare you, God? I've been doing this for you for so long, and you just bless somebody who just came along. We question God's justice when God doesn't smite someone that we know has it coming. We can so easily become the kind of people who are forgiven an enormous debt and then end up showing no concern or sympathy for someone else who owed far less. We often give in to the impulses of our society that shape us to compare ourselves with other people, to compete with each other when it comes to our standing with God, and to create systems of distinction that serve only to prop up our own reality of worthiness and self-righteousness. So this old story actually has a lot to do with us today. There's a lot of application that we can pull from the story, but one truth we can focus on this morning is that God is generous with us all, providing equal amounts of grace. We are to live in the fullness of that generosity, even if we think we don't deserve it, or that we are arriving too late to get it. As the landowner says to the grumbling first hires, take what belongs to you and go. What if they had just done that instead of complaining about what other people received? What if we do that? Just take from God's generosity and go out into our day, our work, in our world, experiencing and fully enjoying what God has given us. Doing so, we will find, will feed our soul, just like the manna in the wilderness fed the Israelites. Can you imagine getting that manna outside of your tent? I mean, it's delivered to you. And you look around and see what other people have, and you begin to complain, forgetting that you have manna. Something God provided from heaven for you. And we ought to enjoy it. We will find a true sense of contentment in our lives if we do this. One that will withstand the pressures that we face from all of the messages in the world around us. And when we take what God has given us and go, we aren't to take it for granted or complain about how we deserve more or something better. And we didn't really get to that in our Exodus passage this morning. But if you read on, you'll see that they're even complaining about having to eat manna every day. We should go back to Egypt where at least we had a better menu than this. And they complain and grumble. It is God's provision for us out of God's abundance of generosity. We take it and go to our family, our friends, our co-workers, and our neighbors with the realization that God has generosity for them as well. No longer being envious of what God has done for them, but celebrating with them and what they have been given too. As we begin this new week, may we take what belongs to us, God's generosity, and may we go with it deeper into our own hearts and then extending it to the people we encounter. Let us pray.